Every time you try to kill the cockroach, it finds another way. It has to, because when you make a product that kills off your consumers, you have to find a way to recruit new customers. How can any company, especially one with such a conscience no less, knowingly manufacture a product that poisons its users? How can any attorney defend a company that would do such a thing? And how can any society tolerate it? But we do. There is no conscience in Washington, which has been bought and paid for. Conscience has to come from you. If real regulation is to happen, it has to come from you.
Hi, my name is Pam Killeen, and welcome to my podcast, Truth Over Spin. This is a separate podcast from my other podcast, which is called Circadian Reboot, where we discuss more along the line of health issues. In Truth Over Spin, my goal is to address the corruption in science, because I'd like to see science clean up. I'd like to see the return to integrity in science and in our media, for that matter. And today, I'm pleased to announce that on the show we have Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who I consider to be a scientist who is indeed trying to bring back integrity to science. Dr. Stephanie Seneff is a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. She holds a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT and has spent much of her career researching the intersection of biology and technology. In recent years, her work has focused on the impact of environmental toxins, particularly glyphosate, on human health. Dr. Seneff has authored numerous peer-reviewed papers exploring the links between glyphosate exposure and chronic diseases, including neurodegenerative disorders, autoimmune conditions, and metabolic dysfunction. She is also the author of Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment, where she details the science behind glyphosate's potential harm. Her other book is entitled Autism: The Journey from Recovery to Prevention. In this book, she explores the potential environmental and dietary factors contributing to the rise in autism, with a focus on glyphosate and other toxins. Her research challenges conventional narratives on food, agriculture, and health, making her a prominent figure in the debate over industrial chemicals and their long-term effects. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. It's such an honor to have you here. I've been following your work for many, many years and admire everything that you research. And I also admire your outspokenness, that you're not afraid to talk about some of the things that you talk about. And so we're going to go after many sacred cows during this call, but I just want to first commend you for your bravery and all of the research that you've done for so many years now. I want to also start by honoring a couple of scientists that you and I have both known, and that's Dr. Mae-Wan Ho and Professor Joe Cummins. And some of the people know that Professor Joe Cummins was a dear, dear friend of mine. He was from London, Ontario, and taught genetics at the University of Western Ontario. And he was friends with Dr. Mae-Wan Ho. And together they were part of a group of scientists called the Institute of Science in Society. They had other amazing scientists in that group, which was an international group, including Dr. Arpad Pushtai. And these scientists were working really diligently to clean up science, to get science back to the integrity that it was intended for. And unfortunately, they were vilified. They were wrongly demonized in my eyes because they really were trying to tell the truth. And this is essentially what RFK Jr. is setting out to do, is to try to clean up science. So we're living in a very interesting time right now. When we look back, Stephanie, I'm sorry to talk so long here. When we look back in the 1800s and you see Dr. Semmelweis, who tried to warn people about hand washing and childbirth and tried to reduce mortality rates just by a simple gesture of washing your hands. And look what happened to Dr. Semmelweis. He was completely ostracized by the medical community for speaking out about hand washing. And then John Yudkin, of course, was ostracized because he believed that sugar was the problem and not animal fat. And then you have Robert O. Becker, who in the 1970s was warning us about the damaging effects of electromagnetic fields. And he was on 60 Minutes on CBS. And the next thing you know, his lab was shut down. His funding was cut off. Same thing happened with Arpad Pushtai when he was warning people about genetically engineered potatoes. And then we have, as well, here in Canada, Dr. Shiv Chopra, who wrote the book Corrupt to the Core, where he was trying to blow the whistle on the corruption in Health Canada. So we see a pattern And I could go on, and I'm sure you know a lot of scientists who have been wrongly ostracized as well. But this is just a pattern that is unacceptable. What, Stephanie, do you see in your area of research? What do you see happening with science and how it's gotten so mutated, how it's all turned into marketing-based science when we really do need clean science to have the facts at hand so that our environment can be healthy and so that we can be healthy? So, what do you see happening to science? Are we living in a time right now where we can see the dream of Dr. Mae-Wan Ho and Professor Joe Cummins, where we can see their dream come true, where we can actually get science back to the integrity that it was intended for?
Thank you for that long introduction. And those people are such fine individuals. They've all paid their dues and suffered because of their willingness to speak out about the problems that we face. It's a very sad time right now, but I'm hopeful for the first time in a long time because of RFK Jr. I'm so excited that he actually has been appointed in charge of HHS, and I think he's going to make big changes, and they're all going to be good. And I think especially to focus on making our children healthy. That is so critical in the United States. The children are so sick right now, and it's been year by year getting worse and worse. And it just frustrates me no end that the government refuses to even acknowledge that there's a problem. And that's going to change. Now they've acknowledged, Trump is on board, it's going to happen. And I think once we acknowledge there's a problem, and then we can focus on understanding what that problem is and what's causing it, and then we can focus on fixing the things that are causing it. I have a lot of hope that America will be a much better place in the next 4 years. I think it's going to be a very exciting time, and I have a lot of hope that things are going to change in a big way, moving in the right direction for a change. It's really a problem that money speaks. I think that's really the core of the problem. Industries produce products that are extremely toxic, and then they protect their product by not allowing the science to be done that shows that the product is toxic. And so meanwhile, we all get poisoned, and the government just says, oh, we're just diagnosing it more. They're not willing to face up to the facts. And so it's all going to change, and for the better, and I'm very hopeful for the future.
They have expressions that they use, just like you mentioned, that, oh, well, we're just diagnosing it more. It's
Correlation
all
doesn't mean
there, that kind of thing.
causation. That's another one. Correlation
Yeah,
doesn't mean
exactly. My mom and dad lived until their late 80s, early 90s. And, you talk to people in that generation and they say when they were younger, the kids were pretty healthy, maybe one quirky kid in the classroom. And then all of a sudden now we see so much illness, so many problems with our young children. I heard you say in another interview, how are they going to grow up and be able to take care
I
of
know.
us? So what is happening
It's
is
going to be
completely
bad. The
unsustainable.
people who are healthy are going to spend all their time taking care of the kids who are unhealthy and the elderly parents who are unhealthy. They're just going to have to spend all their time doing that. No time to advance, science, even because people are too busy taking care of sick people. It could get to that. It's really very costly. And when you think of these autistic kids that can't even speak, many of them can't even speak, and they're going to require full-time care, and they're going to be adults with full-time care very soon. They already are,
Yeah,
the early.
It's a completely unsustainable picture. Hopefully, the Trump and RFK connection will change things, improve things. It's going to take a while because there's going to be a lot of pushback from industry. The advertisers are not going to be happy if somebody's on air slamming processed foods, for example.
I
The
know.
seed oil industry is going to get hit really, really hard because I know RFK Jr. knows a lot about the damaging effects of seed oils, which is something that Sally Fallon and the Weston A. Price Foundation have been warning us about for many, many years now. Dr. Mary Enig, of course,
Right.
has been
Yes.
warning us about that for many, many years. So you mentioned 4 years. What do you see happening, say, if we just talk about the immediate future, 6 months or a year from now? What trends do you see happening potentially?
Well, one thing I'm hoping is that RFK Jr. will actually set up a program that will involve deep science around what's making us sick and really get into deep questions in biology to truly understand the biological mechanisms by which these poisons are causing the problems that they're causing. And then once you can identify that, then you can start to think about how do we get rid of them and how do we change. And so I'm hoping both of those things will kind of happen in parallel, And you mentioned fluoride earlier before we got on air, and fluoride's a good example because it's really it's an example of how you solve an engineering problem. You basically had fluoride was being produced, toxic fluoride compounds were being produced from the phosphate industry, and they were poisoning the cows nearby that were dying, and that's how they recognized that it was a problem. How do you get rid of this toxic fluoride? Well, you just distribute it over the entire country and poison everybody a little bit and hope they don't notice. That's how I see it. it isn't a matter of trying to make your teeth strong. You pretend that it helps to fight cavities, which I don't think it does, because it actually causes your teeth to get discolored. But you pretend that in order to justify putting it in the water supply, and then you solve the problem of this toxic chemical that's a byproduct of an industry. And so that's a nasty situation. And of course, then we have
and
all
look
these
at
poisons
look
that
at the corruption that came from it. I might talk to somebody about fluoride and they look at me and their eyes are glazing over and they say, "How dare you say anything negative about fluoride? It's one of the greatest accomplishments of the 20th century." And they haven't
I
done
know,
an
it's
ounce of
amazing, isn't
research.
it? How well they've messaged on it. And I saw an article on Utah. I heard that Utah was going to be quote unquote the first state, but I want to say Hawaii was the first state because we never had fluoride in Hawaii because of activists who fought it off. But Utah is considering banning fluoride. And the article that wrote about it was being very critical. How could they dare to take this wonderful fluoride out of the water because it's been keeping away all those cavities? It's amazing.
I'll tell you a
It's
funny
very hard
story.
to undo.
We had a public participation meeting here in London, Ontario, many years ago. And we came pretty close to getting fluoride out of the water, but not quite close enough. And Dr. Paul Connett was here to give his 2 cents worth. And I'm sitting in the front row of this meeting. Hundreds of people are in this hall. And to my right, I have Dr. Paul Connett. To my left, I have Professor Joe Cummins. And we're watching this dentist from the University of Western Ontario dentist school. And he's showing pictures of children with rotting teeth. And he's, "Oh, these are my patients. This is what happens. This is these poor children. Their teeth are rotting. We need to keep fluoride in the water." And then Dr. Paul Connett turns to me and he whispers and he says, "Pam, that picture of that child lives in London, Ontario, where the water is fluoridated." This dentist
It's
can't
too
put two
much,
and
isn't
two
it?
together.
It's really amazing what they can get by with, and the messaging really sticks too. I mean, I think, of course, the vaccines is another question that we have to figure out as well.
Right. And I know you've done a lot of research in autism. It sounds to me like you went from studying cholesterol and statins, and then you graduated to questioning vaccines and its connection with autism. Maybe we can talk a little bit about your evolution as to how you got so interested in studying so many of these issues.
It's been a really fun ride, and I really, when I reflect back on the last 15, 20 years, I just feel I smile to think of how much I've learned because I'm just like a student. I'm like a student in graduate school all the time. And I want to give MIT credit for allowing me my job is basically to read the research literature, figure out the biology and write about it, build theories, write the theories, publish articles. I love my job, and it's exactly what I love to do. So, I like a puzzle, and biology is like the mother of all puzzles, so I'm really loving it. And I've moved on, I've had stages in which I discover something new that totally changes my perspective, and then I go deep dive into something else. So it's been a great journey. And starting with autism, really, it was back in 2006, 2007 that I was watching the autism rates go up every year. And and of course, we're just diagnosing it more, no problem. And I didn't think that was true. I thought there's got to be something. And of course, all the funding went into genetics. Nearly all the funding went into genetics. There's got to be a genetic, reason for this, and we're going to find out which genes. And they found a whole bunch of different genes that had very small effects, but nothing stood out, And meanwhile, it has to be that something in the environment is poisoning these kids. And I wanted to find out what it was. So I started just studying autism itself and learning about the disease process of autism. And I became aware that many of the autistic kids have a lot of gut problems. So I was thinking it's got to be something in the water, something in the food, something they're eating, something they're putting into their mouths. And it was really just serendipitous in 2012 that I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber gave a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. And I didn't know what glyphosate was when I walked into the room. And when I finished that lecture, I walked away convinced that I had found my answer. And then I devoted the next 10 years in my book, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment, came out almost a decade later, after I had really researched the problem very deeply and became even more convinced. The more I looked, the more certain I became that I think glyphosate, which is Roundup, and it's all over the food supply, is the number one cause. It's not the only thing that causes autism, but it's the cause of the epidemic, the primary cause of the epidemic, I believe.
And they spray millions and millions of pounds of this stuff in our crops. in North America. Around the world, I'm sure it's being used in other countries as well. So it's really, really hard to avoid. They're finding, even in organic crops, they find traces of
Right.
glyphosate just because it transfers over from other fields, things
It's in
like
the
that.
rain.
It's in the
Yeah, it's in
rain.
the rain.
I heard you
It's in the
talk about
manure.
honey
I mean, that's another source. Right.
and
Yeah.
manure. Yeah,
There was
but
an
even honey
interesting
is
article.
contaminated.
Well, I read an interesting article on honey that was well done, and they collected samples of honey from many parts of the world, from Mexico and from Canada, from the United States, and from other places, and then they had a whole plot of the. They had a big graph of the amounts that they found in individual samples across, and they had them organized by the source, and you could see where the United States was, because it totally stood out. The ones that were from the United States had the high levels. And Canada didn't do too well either. Mexico was good. Mexico had much lower levels. And that's consistent with other studies. You may know of Tony Mitra. Have you heard of Tony Mitra? He's a
No, I heard
Canadian
you talking
citizen.
about him in another interview, though, and I was going to look him up after we
Yeah.
spoke. Yeah. So go ahead
Yeah, he
and
lives on,
talk
on
about
the
him.
west side of
I think you
Canada.
mentioned he did a book about the toxins.
He did.
Yeah.
It's called Poison Foods of North America, very aptly named. And he basically harassed the Canadian government for many years and finally got them to test. And they tested over 8,000 food samples for glyphosate. And of course, they found it in all kinds of places. So his book is basically about their results. They gave him all the results, and he's published it in that book. And what it showed was that the United States and Canada stand out against Mexico and Europe. Mexico and Europe consistently had lower levels across the board of glyphosate in all the different foods they looked at. And particularly striking was garbanzo beans, chickpeas, and lentils from Canada that had very, very high levels. I think some of the highest levels were in those legumes from Canada. And he actually went to India, and he gave a lot of talks in India with very big audiences, where he was talking about this Canadian lentils having all this problem. And so some of the counties in India actually banned Canadian imports of these beans because of this result. So it came back and haunted Canada with this issue that their legumes are too heavily contaminated with glyphosate. But you know, hummus is like a great food. I love hummus, and so now I won't ever eat it unless I know it's organic.
Right. Now,
Which
can
is
you talk
frustrating.
about the toxicity of glyphosate? You talk about it as potentially damaging the kidneys, a catalyst to lead towards even degenerative diseases, cancer. So you've got a long, long list of how and why it can affect us in our health. Even maybe even talk about its connection with the gut microbiome and autism. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. But could you maybe just
Try
elaborate
to
as to
talk
why
about it
it's
in
so
a few
toxic?
words. Yeah, it's a big topic. It's a really interesting topic, and I'm really intrigued by glyphosate. Like I said, I enjoy biology, and I believe glyphosate has a really interesting, unique mechanism of toxicity that has not been proven, but I feel like the evidence is overwhelming that it's true. The industry doesn't want to admit it, but Monsanto's own studies are some of the best evidence that this is happening. And I will say what this is, a bit technical, but I think people should be able to understand it. Basically, glyphosate is a glycine. It's a glycine molecule. Glycine is the smallest amino acid, and the amino acids, about 20 amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins, according to the famous DNA code. And so glyphosate is a glycine molecule, except that it has extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom. And that extra material makes a huge difference in its behavior. So it has very different properties biophysically and biochemically compared to glycine. But it matches glycine as far as the code is concerned. So when the assembly line sees a code for glycine, it picks up glyphosate by mistake and puts it in to the protein. And you can actually find out which proteins are very sensitive to certain glycine residues being substituted. And you can predict what would happen if they were substituted by glyphosate. You can predict it by looking at mutations where they're substituted by other amino acids that have very similar properties to glyphosate. So I went rummaging through the research literature looking for proteins that have severe genetic diseases when that glycine is replaced by another amino acid that is similar to glyphosate, has bulkier and has a negative charge. And you can then infer from that if glyphosate were to substitute for that glycine, you would get very sick. And I've managed to accumulate a long list of proteins that I can associate with diseases whose incidence is going up exactly in step with glyphosate. So it's a giant jigsaw puzzle that I've put together, and I talk about it in my book. to show, and so people say, well, how could one chemical cause so many diseases? Because we have a whole bunch of correlation. I did a lot of studies, correlation studies between glyphosate and disease, looking over time, over the period of time for which we had information on how much glyphosate is being used on core crops in the United States. So you take that plot and you go looking through all these different diseases to see which ones are also going up. And you find astonishing correlations with extremely small p-values for the likelihood that it could be by chance. For diabetes, obesity, autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, kidney disease, liver disease, fatty liver disease, inflammatory bowel disease, pancreatic cancer, thyroid cancer, all of these things are going up dramatically over time in the United States, exactly in step with the increase in the use of glyphosate on core crops. So I think it's all causal. I think all of it's causal, and I can explain it through this unusual mechanism that only glyphosate has. I don't know of a single other molecule that has that particular mechanism.
Yeah, I've heard another scientist talk about fluoride as being a Frankenstein molecule. So it basically grabs onto other elements and turns into something that's just completely foreign to the body. The body doesn't know how to use it. And it sounds to me like what you're describing is something like a Frankenstein
It is
molecule that's
similar, in
being
fact.
created because of glyphosate.
It's similar because fluoride actually combines with aluminum to make these aluminum fluoride products that look a lot like phosphate. So it's kind of similar to glyphosate in the sense that it's a mimetic of a really important molecule in biology. And so phosphate is incredibly important in biology. And but aluminum combines with fluoride to make a phosphate lookalike, a phosphate analog, and that goes everywhere phosphate goes and messes things up in a big way, completely changes the signaling mechanisms and everything. It's a really big mess. I wrote about that. There was a paper that I published together with a bunch of colleagues critiquing fluoride, and I wrote that paper, I believe, before I even knew about glyphosate, or maybe I was just learning about glyphosate when I wrote that. It was early.
These two stories seem to intertwine because you do talk about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and aluminum, of course, is very damaging to the brain. Can you maybe talk? I don't know if you can marry those two stories together.
I certainly can,
can you?
because actually glyphosate binds to aluminum as well. And it's been shown theoretically that two glyphosate molecules will wrap around an aluminum atom and hide its +3 charge, basically cancel it out. So it becomes a small neutral molecule. A neutral molecule can get back past the gut barrier much more easily than a charged atom. So aluminum has a +3 charge, which makes it hard for it to get across the gut barrier. And of course, the gut barrier is also usually pretty secure. So glyphosate actually sets up a leaky gut through its other problems that it causes. It sets up a leaky gut, which allows small molecules, small uncharged molecules to get across. And then it creates a small uncharged molecule from the aluminum atom and allows it to cross the gut barrier. And then glyphosate also induces a leaky brain barrier, which then allows the aluminum to get across the brain barrier as well. And I've written about aluminum and glyphosate working synergistically to deliver both aluminum and glyphosate to the pineal gland, which is outside of the brain barrier. And I believe that that is a causal factor in sleep disorder, which is another one of the diseases that's conditions that are going up dramatically. So I think
because it would affect your melatonin, correct?
Well, it does affect your melatonin because that's a product of the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously disrupts. So not only is there a melatonin deficiency, which is going to affect your sleep, but also the pineal gland, of course, is what makes the melatonin, and it also sulfates the melatonin and releases it into the brain ventricles at night when you're sleeping. Very important to have that sulfated melatonin. Glyphosate messes up the sulfate system as well, so it's hurting sleep disorder every which way.
Mm-hmm. You do talk a lot about sulfur and sulfation being such a key detoxification pathway in the body. How does glyphosate mess with the sulfation?
Yeah, and that's, again, a complicated story, but it has to do with several enzymes that have what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif. I define it in my book, and what it is that it has at least one glycine residue in the protein at a spot where the protein binds phosphate, and that glycine residue is really critical, that if you change it to something else, that protein is really sick. So it's a critical glycine residue at a place where the protein binds phosphate. And it turns out there's lots of proteins that bind phosphate at a place where there's at least one glycine, often as many as 3 or 4 glycines at that site. And the glycine is critical because it's small. It allows room for that bulky phosphate to fit into a socket that's created by the protein, the way that it folds. So when glyphosate has room to fit its methylphosphonate unit into the place where the phosphate of the substrate is supposed to go. So it blocks the substrate from binding. That's exactly what happens with EPSP synthase. That's the enzyme that it famously disrupts in the plants, kills all the weeds, kills a lot of microbes as well because of that same pathway, because the microbes have that shikimate pathway. EPSP synthase is a central enzyme in the shikimate pathway that glyphosate blocks. Glyphosate messes up that enzyme. That enzyme has a glycine residue at a place where it binds a phosphate in the molecule PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate. So when glyphosate substitutes for that glycine, it blocks PEP. PEP can't bind, and then the enzyme can't do its job. And then you block the entire pathway. You have no aromatic amino acids. It's going to really reduce your supply of aromatic amino acids, which are not only building blocks of proteins. They're 3 of the essential of the 20 amino acids. They're essential because our cells can't make them, and they're precursors to all kinds of important molecules, including, of course, melanin and melatonin. Melanin, the skin tanning agent, thyroid hormone, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, all of these critical neurotransmitters all come out of that shikimate pathway. So we get a disruption, we get a deficiency in all of these neurotransmitters, as well as the skin tanning agent. So people can, easily burn when they're exposed to the sun because they don't have enough melanin.
It's even down to the mitochondrial level where it can damage ALDH. That is an enzyme within the mitochondria that can actually be adversely affected by the glyphosate as well.
ALDH, is that a dehydrogenase, right? Is that?
Yes.
It disrupts a whole bunch of dehydrogenases, and there have been studies on humans as well. Succinate dehydrogenase is an incredibly important enzyme in the mitochondria that's been shown to be suppressed by glyphosate, and when it's suppressed, it's actually connected to cancer as well. I mean, low succinate dehydrogenase is a characteristic feature of many cancers, and there are all kinds of other dehydrogenases that are also suppressed, including a bunch of microbial dehydrogenases. There was a study on E. coli. They found a dozen different dehydrogenases that were suppressed, including NADH dehydrogenase, which is a really important enzyme in the mitochondria that actually delivers the protons to the mitochondrial intramembrane space that drive the ATP production. So the ATP synthesis gets disrupted. There's several papers that show that glyphosate causes mitochondrial damage, and I think that's a central aspect of its toxicity, is the disruption of the mitochondria.
Yeah, because so many people have so low energy today. People are so tired, and they're trying to figure out how to get energy.
Well, chronic fatigue is a syndrome that's become, common, and I think it's a direct hit. Glyphosate is causing you not to be able to. Your muscles can't make enough ATP, and so you're weak. It's very simple.
Yeah, well, you talk a lot about the enzymes, even the liver enzymes, and how glyphosate is just going to universally affect the body at so many different levels. Right. So how are we going to, eating organic, eating local, it's impossible to avoid this stuff. How do we undo this damage? Is there a way to pull glyphosate out of the body? Is there a way to detoxify glyphosate from the body?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer for sure, but I do have friends who are nutritionists and alternative medicine specialists who promote certain treatments that they think can help. Certainly getting enough sulfur is really important, getting enough dietary sulfur. And some of them will say, should take N-acetylcysteine as a supplement because that's a precursor to glutathione. Glutathione is disrupted by glyphosate. Glyphosate both depletes glutathione in the liver and causes it to be oxidized, which is not effective if it's oxidized. Glutathione is an extremely important antioxidant in the brain also, but in the liver and the brain, and of course everywhere in the body actually. Glutathione is so important. And people can have glutathione deficiency. It's got a glycine as well. Glutathione is 3 amino acids, and glycine and cysteine are 2 of them. The third one is glutamate. And so both the cysteine and the glycine are compromised by glyphosate. And so therefore the glutathione becomes deficient. And glyphosate also wastes glutathione by causing increase in an enzyme that metabolizes it. So there's a lot of ways in which glyphosate disrupts glutathione. And so people can think in terms of resupplying things that can help you produce glutathione can be helpful for being able to cope with the glyphosate, not necessarily remove it, but just cope with it better because of that. Other things are like, I think fermented foods are excellent, and they may even be excellent for a reason that has to do with providing you with microbes that might be able to metabolize glyphosate. There's very few microbes that know how to break it down. That's one problem. One big problem with glyphosate is it's hard to break down. And there's only a few microbes that can do it, but there are some species of Acetobacter that can break it down. And so they can actually turn it into nutrients, because any microbe that can break it down can release the phosphorus and the nitrogen. It actually is a good source of nutrients, if you could break it down. But while
It
it's
seems like
around,
a
it's
vicious
toxic.
circle, though, because the glyphosate is disrupting the gut microbiome, and yet you need certain
Right.
species in order to break down. It's a puppy chasing the tail.
Yeah, it could kill the species that are supposed to break it down. Although I think that the ones that can break it down have a lead over the other species because they can detox it. They know how to detoxify it, and in fact, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is one of the species that can break it down, and they've become a huge problem in the hospitals as a pathogen. And I suspect that part of their benefit today is that everybody's being poisoned by glyphosate, and they can survive because they can break it down. And they're even performing a source. They're helping the host by removing the glyphosate. So it's kind of ironic because they cause nasty symptoms and they can kill you, but they can clear the glyphosate. Same thing with cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are also able to break down glyphosate, and they've become a big problem in the waterways. For example, in the Florida waterways, there's a lot of cyanobacteria that are breaking down glyphosate and releasing its phosphorus and its nitrogen, which become nutrients for the algae to grow, and so you get a massive algae overgrowth. The red tide, you get toxic metabolites coming out from the algae that can then cause the seafood to be unhealthy and make you sick, And so it's a nasty cascade. But the base of it is removing the glyphosate. The cyanobacteria are performing a service by clearing the glyphosate and turning it into nutrients. But then there's too many nutrients, and so you get excessive growth of the algae, and that causes a lot of problems.
Now, I know you've done a lot of research on autism. We were going to talk about that as well. What do you believe could be causing it? And also, what could be the connection with the vaccines?
Right. Vaccines is where I started. When I first started studying autism, I suspected that the vaccines might be causing it. And I actually did a study. I did a lot of studies on the VAERS database, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is this, database that people can submit to if they have a vaccine injury. They can submit a report. Anybody can submit, not just a doctor. And so that's a very useful and interesting database, and I really found it quite powerful. But of course, the one thing the industry likes to say is that database is not reliable. So I had trouble publishing my papers. They would say, you can't use that database because it's not reliable. And it's the only database we have. It's what we're using to monitor. And so there's some kind of twisted thing there where we can't look at the data that we've been collecting. Yet the data were quite striking. And I just started looking at all the different vaccines to see if any one of them stood out as far as being correlated with autism. Because the database would actually have the information this child was autistic, so I could just look for autism plus and all the different vaccines and do a lot of statistical analyses. And MMR popped out. And I was surprised because MMR doesn't have aluminum, it doesn't have mercury. I didn't expect it to be MMR, and I didn't know at that time about the history of MMR and the story in the UK.
With Dr. Andrew Wakefield?
Exactly. I found out about Andrew Wakefield after I did my research on the VAERS database, because I'm looking at MMR and I'm thinking, well, why is it this one? That's weird, because I was expecting aluminum mercury, didn't have either one. And so I was puzzled, but then I did manage to finally get the paper published. It was hard. I would have journals reject it without even allowing it to go through the review process.
Dr. Wakefield was a gastroenterologist, so he was talking about the gut lining and how it was
about the gut,
adverse.
yes.
Yeah.
It was amazing. He was very progressive in his paper. I read his paper then once I figured out MMR, and I even referenced it. But it's his work is solid, and he made a good point. And actually then later on I discovered, so I was saying to my friends that MMR could be contaminated, or the vaccines could be contaminated with glyphosate. It occurred to me that they could be because the live virus in particular vaccines are grown on substrates. What they feed them could easily have glyphosate in it because they're feeding them like derivatives of collagen, lots and lots of glycine and collagen. And I know collagen is contaminated with glyphosate because my friend Anthony Samsel, he's done a lot of samples of different interesting things and found glyphosate in collagen, both in bone. He got a CAFO cow bone, and he found glyphosate in it. He got a hoof from a cow that died of founder, which is a disease of the hoof. and he found high levels of glyphosate in that hoof. The hoof has lots and lots of collagen. Collagen has a long, long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. And so glyphosate substituting for that glycine is going to mess up the collagen. And we have a lot of issues these days with various joint problems and back pain and neck pain and knee surgery and hip surgery. We have all these problems with our bones and our joints. I suspect glyphosate's a major cause of all of that.
This ties into deuterium. We haven't talked about deuterium yet, right? So it could be a combination of the glyphosate and the deuterium and the collagen, correct?
Yes, in fact, deuterium actually, it's interesting because the bones actually trap deuterium. There was a fascinating article that was referred to me by a friend about sea lions. And sea lions dive really deep, and they go into deep water where there's a lot of water pressure. So their bones have to be really strong in order for them to be protected from the pressure of the deep water. And these authors discovered that their bones were highly enriched in deuterium. They were able to put extra deuterium into their bones, into the proline molecules in their bones, which was really, really interesting. And that's, of course, there's lots of proline in collagen. So the collagen has the proline which can trap deuterium. And I think that, and that's very interesting because collagen is outside of the cell. It's well away from the mitochondria. So I think the body actually, not just the seals, but everybody, all of the mammals and even all of the species that have bones are able to, I suspect, trap deuterium in their collagen, which is outside the cell, keeping it away from the mitochondria. Because the mitochondria want to have extremely low deuterium because it wrecks the ATPase pumps. And this is what I've gotten into this, I've become obsessed with deuterium in the last few years. And
It's very, very interesting.
Interested.
So deuterium is going to be around us, in us. It's there. It's natural and
Yeah.
it's normal for us to have some deuterium.
Right.
But do you think it's the glyphosate that is actually causing us to trap it in the body and not get rid of it?
No, in fact, it's very complicated. Glyphosate is actually causing us not to be able to keep it out of the mitochondria. And it's also because you have all this extracellular matrix, outside the cell with the gelled water. This is Gerald Pollack's work.
Easy water, yeah.
Easy water, right. Lining all the blood vessels around all the cells, gelled water. And that gelled water is created by sulfate, and the sulfate is in these glycosaminoglycans that are attached to, for example, collagen. So collagen has tons of glycine. So collagen doesn't form correctly because of the glyphosate. It didn't even get stuck inside the cell. So it's harder for you to make enough collagen, and it's also harder for you to add the sulfate because the sulfation system gets messed up by glyphosate. The sulfate is what creates the gel. The gel is what traps the deuterium. So not only the proline in the collagen molecules, but also the water itself in the gel. And this is what's really fascinating to me. And Pollack has shown that the gelled water creates a battery, and it pushes the protons out. And so that battery, he thinks, is a source of energy for the body. Really fascinating work. And my understanding is that what it will push out is protons, not deuterons, because we haven't talked about what deuterium is, but deuterium is
we can backtrack if we want to.
heavy hydrogen. Heavy hydrogen. It has an extra neutron, so it's a proton with a proton. So a hydrogen atom has a proton and an electron. And a deuterium atom has a proton and an electron and a neutron. And the neutron is just as heavy as a proton, so it's twice as heavy as hydrogen. It's an isotope of hydrogen, a natural isotope, and it's found everywhere. And it goes everywhere. It goes everywhere that hydrogen goes. But your body has figured out strategically how to, many different proteins are involved in this process of capturing the deuterium outside of the cell and keeping the deuterium out of the mitochondria. There's enzymes that know how to deliver protons but not deuterons to the mitochondria. And there are enzymes that know how to trap deuterium but not protium in the gel. So there's a whole network of activities that go on in the body. I think the body obsesses on keeping deuterium out of the mitochondria, and when the mitochondria get too much deuterium, they get sick. And the really, really cool thing is that the microbes play a really important role in providing deuterium-depleted nutrients to the host in the gut. And glyphosate messes that up in a big way. And so that's critically the short-chain fatty acids. And so you probably have heard, anyone who's studying the gut is aware that the microbes make these short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate. And butyrate in particular is extremely important for the colon. the colon gets sick. The colonocytes love butyrate. That's their favorite food. It's a small fatty acid. And glyphosate, so glyphosate messes up the enzyme that the colonocytes use to metabolize the butyrate, but it also messes up the bacteria's ability to make the butyrate. So the butyrate is deficient. The colonocytes can't metabolize it well, and the colonocytes can't make the sulfate that is necessary to make the sulfomucins that line the gut. The sulfomucins are eaten by microbes that can make the butyrate. So it's a whole complicated mess that gets destroyed by the glyphosate in multiple different ways.
Wow. And then we talked about vaccines and autism, but this must also have a role in the brain and autistic behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccines, I want to get back to the MMR because it turns out then that my friend Zen Honeycutt, who's the founder of Moms Across America, and my friend Anthony Samsel, who's a scientist, they both tested several different vaccines for glyphosate. And they found it consistently in the live virus vaccines. The ones that had aluminum didn't typically have glyphosate. But the live virus vaccines don't have aluminum because it'll kill the virus. The virus needs to stay alive. But they did have glyphosate, and MMR had significantly more than any other vaccine. So it's conceivable that the glyphosate in the MMR is what's causing the MMR to be bad. It may be a major factor, which is an interesting thought, that it actually might be the glyphosate that's causing the MMR problem, which is causing the autism.
Well, I mean, so many people I've talked to for so many decades now, they'll tell me my child was normal. You know, my 2-year-old boy, my 2-year-old girl, they were just fine. And then they got the vaccine and the next day, like the effects are so immediate. And it's...
Well, I do think it's other things besides the glyphosate in the vaccines. And I actually have reached the point where my personal belief as of now is that there's no vaccine that's both safe and effective. I think that when you look at the trade-off between what the vaccine does for you that's bad and what it does for you that's good, in my opinion, bad will always win out over good. That I think we should.
Well, in science, you have the precautionary principle, right? Like, if in doubt, if there's any doubt at all, leave it out.
Yeah, it's interesting how they're able to make a good case. You know, people are very easily understand the idea that, oh, we give everybody measles vaccine, they won't get measles. If they believe that works, and measles is a terrible disease, so we don't want people to get measles, they don't think about what else is it doing. And actually, all the vaccines are messing up the immune system. They're messing up the innate immunity and making it weaker. And it's the weakened innate immune system that finally kills you. I mean, that's how you get old. You have an immune system aging is a direct path to death, eventually. You're going to get very susceptible to various infections, you know, pneumonia, flu. I mean, the flu vaccines have gotten worse and worse. It's really interesting that the flu vaccine is getting less and less effective every year. That's because we're massively vaccinating everybody. So everybody has a weaker immune system, innate immunity in general against everything. And now people are more susceptible to the flu because their immune system is weak. The innate immune system that doesn't have to depend on antibodies at all is weak. Yeah. So now you need the antibodies. You get caught in a catch-22, you know?
Yeah, back in World War I, the soldiers who allegedly had the flu, which could have been who knows what they were sick with, but at any rate, the hospitals were full, and a lot of the soldiers were put outside in pup tents, and they lay on cots outside all day long. And the ones that were outside in the sun all day long, their outcomes were far greater than the soldiers that were in the hospitals, where they probably had closed windows and didn't have access to the sun and so on. I mean, Mother Nature has our answers for us, but what have they done to the sun? They've wrongly demonized it, right?
Oh, I know. It's absolutely the case, and I get really frustrated. I get, every time I see a little 2-year-old with sunglasses on, I want to rip them off because you need to have the sun exposure to the eyes to reach the pineal gland. And I think that inadequate sunlight exposure to the pineal gland links to autism. So I think sunlight is really important, not just on the skin, but also in the eyes. And we're so obsessed with sunglasses, we think we're protecting our eyes. I never wore sunglasses my whole life, and I spend a lot of time out in the sun. And my eyes are great. I don't have any of the problems people get. I don't have the cataracts. I don't have the macular degeneration or any of those things. My eyes are fine. In fact, my doctor... I stopped, I wore glasses. I don't have 20/20 vision, and I wore glasses for most of my life. And as I got aware of the importance of the sun, I started taking my glasses off when I went outside. And then I said, well, I don't really need my glasses at all. I'll just wear them if I have to see the screen or something, you know. I'll mostly leave them off. So I got more and more, fewer and fewer moments in which I was wearing glasses. And then I sort of lost my glasses and they didn't work anymore. So I just said, okay, I don't need them. And then I finally went to a doctor because I had to pass a driver's test, and my glasses were not working. They weren't correcting my vision in such a way that I could actually read. So I figured I'd flunk the driver's test if I didn't do something. So I went to get a new pair of glasses. And the doctor, was interesting. He said, most people when they get older, their eyes get worse, but yours got better. My glasses were overcorrecting my vision. It was so fun.
The
So
same
I got
story
my new
applies to
glasses.
me as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
You went
It was
outside
really
this, then
interesting.
stop wearing glasses, your eyes get stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Now, another reason why you got involved in this is because of your husband's health and the question of saturated fat and cholesterol, statin drugs, and you started questioning everything because of the diagnosis and the treatment your husband had. So maybe we can backtrack and talk about that. I think you got involved in that story before you
Yes,
got involved in glyphosate, and you just started learning
that
to
was.
question everything.
Yeah, I was actually at the same time that I started studying autism, I also started studying heart disease because my husband we were surprised that he was diagnosed with heart disease at a pretty young age, really. Well, he wasn't young, but he did have heart disease, and the doctor wanted him to take a high dose statin for the rest of his life. And so, of course, I immediately started researching statins, and I didn't like what I saw at all. And we kind of had a battle over that first year where I really wanted my husband off the statins altogether, and the doctor thought he had to take 4 times the normal dosage for the rest of his life, so we had a very big difference. So basically I worked on my husband the whole year, and he gradually cut back on his statin. He did it very slowly over the year and finally got down to 0, and then he never took it again for his whole life. So I had convinced him. We fired the doctor because he was very upset. He said, I'll be at your funeral. He was like determined to make Victor think he would die. It was really pretty awful. So we got a new doctor who was willing to put up with. He wasn't thrilled, but he was willing to put up with the idea that he'd not take a statin drug. And he hasn't had a heart attack. I mean, he's 89 he's 79 years old. 79
Now,
years
but
old
you
and
also
alive.
learned about the benefits of animal fat as well. Like I know
Yes.
you use lard for your cooking.
Butter,
You're not afraid of
butter and
butter,
lard.
eggs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he eats a high cholesterol diet, which is ironic. But
Yeah. But you know about the
so
benefits of cholesterol. I mean, everybody thinks cholesterol is the bad guy, and yet we need
oh, I know, it's
cholesterol
so
to.
crazy. People go
Yeah.
into they'll go into a vegan diet because they're trying to avoid cholesterol and they know that plants don't have it. So people will do that, I think, just to try to keep away from cholesterol. And it's so sad because cholesterol is absolutely essential. It's a distinction. I think that mammals depend on cholesterol the way plants depend on chlorophyll. I think it's that important. It's really, really essential for mammalian life. And the idea that you would try to restrict it or that you would try to prevent the liver from making it, it just makes no sense whatsoever. Of course, also that pathway, the mevalonate pathway, it produces many other things that are really vital for your health, and including vitamin D, of course. Vitamin D comes from cholesterol. And so
The sex
it,
hormones.
it's
I'll tell you an
exactly.
interesting story. At our hospital, University Hospital here at Western University, I was talking to a couple who I think it was the husband who had heart disease of some sort, and he and his wife enrolled in a nutrition class that was being endorsed by the university hospital, and they were promoting a vegan diet as part of their
Hmm.
rehabilitation for anybody suffering with heart disease.
That's so
And so they
terrible.
went through several weeks of this weekly course. And at one point, they said to the instructor after class, they said, we've been doing this vegan diet and we noticed that we don't have any more libido. It's gone.
Yes.
And the instructor says, no, we don't talk about those things here. We just don't talk about it. And we're totally
Yeah,
sloughed off by
interesting.
the instructor. I mean, they don't have their
Interesting.
precursors for their hormones anymore. It's gone
Right,
from their diet.
exactly.
No cholesterol.
Yeah, and the statins, of course, cause that problem too. So they cause a lot of side effects. That's another thing that I studied back when I did the work on statins. I looked at drug side effects. We actually looked at online reports from on the web from people who were just there were websites where you could just tell your story about your drug. You're taking this drug, you have these side effects, and so we gathered a lot of data from those sites, comparing statin drugs with all the other drugs that people were taking, age matched. So we had exactly the same age distribution for the control group compared to the people who were taking the statin drugs. And we looked at various side effects to see which ones were more significantly associated with statin drugs compared to the others. And we got a really awful list of things, including like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, problems of the brain, because the brain has way more cholesterol per cell than other parts of the body. It's really loaded with cholesterol, and the brain, of course, needs that cholesterol to work properly. And so I think it's really, statin drugs are going to really mess up your brain.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we should start winding down here, or I'm going to take up your whole day. It's just such a pleasure speaking with you. What projects have you got planned in your future? Are you looking at writing a book potentially on neurodegenerative diseases? I think I heard you talking about that. Or have you got
That
any
would
other
be fun.
projects in mind?
Yeah, well, lately I've been obsessed with, as I said, deuterium, but also the role of deuterium in the mitochondria on neurodegenerative disease, and specifically my suspicion that all these misfolded proteins, there's all these proteins that can misfold into nasty fibrils. You have the amyloid beta for Parkinson's disease, and you've got the, amyloid beta for Alzheimer's, and alpha-synuclein for Parkinson's disease, and you've got the prion protein, which is the source of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So all of these brain diseases that are associated with misfolded proteins. And there's also blood diseases that are associated with misfolded proteins. And of course, even the spike protein is involved there as well. So I've been looking at protein misfolding and how it happens and what's going on, and trying to see if deuterium plays a role, because my hunch is that it does. And if I can figure that out, I will be very, very proud. But we're working hard on that. That's the paper that I'm working on right now with my colleagues, Greg Nye and Anthony Kyriakopoulos. The three of us have been writing papers together for some time now, and we really
And have you
enjoy
got the ear
deep dive.
of RFK Jr.? Is he interested at all in your research? Is he reaching out
I
to you?
think so. He certainly knows me, and he wrote a blurb on my book, and I helped him out with that lawsuit. When they had the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the first case, he was on the team, and I handed him some links to some articles. I gave him some articles about glyphosate to help him do the research for that, and he knows me. I've actually met him at autism conferences. He's given some fantastic keynotes at autism conferences where I've been present. So I'm hoping he knows me enough. hoping that he can get interested in deuterium, and we'll see. I know
He's got a lot on his plate right now. I know
I know.
I've been studying the raw milk issue as well for many, many years through the Weston A. Price Foundation. And I know Mark McAfee out in California, and he might become I don't know if that's been announced yet, but he's on the table anyway to be an advisor for the FDA. I don't see why they couldn't turn to you and ask you for some advice from time to time.
That's exactly
You've got
what I
so
would
much
like.
research. Yeah.
Yes, I would be happy to share whatever they're interested in knowing more about. I would be happy to share it. Yes, I'm not willing to move to Washington, so I sort of nixed the idea. Plus, I don't really like politics, so I didn't really want to get involved. And I'm very happy in my job. I want to just keep on doing this forever. I really love it. And
Well, I mean,
very
they've shown us that
productive.
going back to the glyphosate and the sprays, they've shown that we can produce food organically and supply enough food for our
I mean,
populations.
we did. We lived without glyphosate, throughout history until about 30, 40 years ago. So we surely can live without it again. I think we need to get rid of all the herbicides, all the non-organic. There are some ways you can kill plants that are not as bad, that you can use organic materials and help to work with the weeds. But pulling them by hand is going to cost a lot of labor. But we have robots that are coming along that could actually zap them with boiling water. There are ways in which you could use a robotic tractor, I think, to help to assist with controlling the weeds. That would be organic. It would be safe.
Yeah, so many advancements coming up through the woodwork and so much research, but so many scientists are so suppressed with their voices, their knowledge. It's really hard to get this information out. Mainstream media really doesn't touch it.
Hopefully that'll change. We'll see.
Well,
So
we'll see.
I'm
Fingers
excited.
crossed.
It's a great time to be alive, and change is in the air, and we can all hope that the message will get out, the right message will get out, and people,
Yeah,
and of course individuals can make a big difference. Buy organic. Don't buy the food. If you don't buy the toxic food, they won't make it.
exactly. Yeah, buy local, buy organic, eat whole foods. Just get outside, get fresh air, sunshine, honor nature, and we can get our health back. It's going to take a while to undo the damage that's been done to us for the last 40 or 50 years. This idea of poisoning us to get us healthy is just ludicrous.
It is. It is. It's got to change.
I always talk about the
So,
Green Revolution. They use the Green Revolution to bring in
I
a
know.
lot of this toxicity, and it comes around the same time as the pharmaceutical industry. Chemical upon
Yeah.
chemical. How can we be healthy with all those chemicals?
Right, you just pour more chemicals with the pharmaceutical drugs, are just more chemicals on top of the other chemicals, so it's all toxic.
It's a toxic soup. Anyway, Dr. Seneff, thank you so much for taking your very valuable time to be with me here today and share your wonderful knowledge. Hopefully, with any luck, I'll get you back on the show again. You just keep up the great work, and if you have any news to report, please let me know, and I'll share it with everybody.
Great, thank you.
The information in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. We are not licensed healthcare providers, and our content is not a substitute for professional medical diagnosis, advice, or treatment. For personalized health guidance, or if you have specific medical concerns, please consult a qualified medical professional. They can assess your individual health needs and offer recommendations tailored to you. By listening to this podcast, you agree to this disclaimer. We assume no responsibility or liability for actions taken based on the information provided here.